Hi, this is Bob. On today's Wright Show, I'm pulling a Terry Gross. She is, of course, the legendary NPR host whose interview archives are so deep that when pretty much anybody who's very famous dies, she can run an old conversation with them on her show. The famous person in my archives who just passed away is Edward O. Wilson, the Harvard evolutionary biologist who entered popular awareness in the mid-1970s as author of the book Sociobiology. The controversy over sociobiology made the cover of Time magazine and had a big impact on me. About a third of my first book, Three Scientists and Their Gods, was about Ed and sociobiology, and my second book, The Moral Animal, was about evolutionary psychology, which Ed considered basically a rebranded version of sociobiology and which certainly has a lot of overlap with sociobiology. I really liked Ed a lot. He came from humble origins and had a difficult childhood, but through talent and determination, he wound up as an eminent biologist, arguably the world's leading expert on insects. And though the sociobiology controversy was painful for him, he got through it and used the fame it gave him to advocate for taking better care of planet Earth. I'm not sure of the recording date of this conversation, but it's at least 16 years ago and maybe closer to 20. So Ed was in his mid-70s. He died the day after this past Christmas at age 92. First of all, thanks for taking the time, Ed. I wanted to start out by asking you how vindication feels. About 30 years ago, you published the book Sociobiology, and you proclaimed that we were going to see a revolution in the Darwinian understanding of behavior, animal behavior, but including human behavior. You took a lot of heat for it, and not just intellectual criticism, but some really nasty ad hominem stuff, and I know you had some unpleasant times here at Harvard. Now, 30 years later, so far as I can tell, it looks like you were right. There's this whole worldview that you outlined is much more widely accepted, seems to be gaining momentum. And I would think that if you're the kind of animal that you say humans are, you would take some delight in the vanquishing of your foes.
I wouldn't put it that way today. I don't think it so much in terms of vindication now as I do a full blooming of a scientific development that actually has been made possible by thousands of researchers. 30 years ago, I suggested, actually it was 34 years ago, because I really laid out the whole idea in a book on social insects, ants and other insects with highly advanced societies.
The Insect
That is the
Society
idea
was the book, yeah.
of a discipline of sociobiology. And I said, if we take Darwinian principles and we combine them with what we are learning about genetics, neurophysiology, and the like, then we will have a well-ordered new discipline of the study of the biological basis of social behavior. And that was basically the idea. When I wrote a comprehensive volume, most people didn't pay much attention to work on ants and termites, wrote a comprehensive one. It was Sociobiology, the New Synthesis, which was published in 1975. I had most of the book devoted to animals, which is where it belongs, I guess, particularly in those days, since we didn't know that much about the biology of social behavior in humans. But I had a chapter that I added on human beings, just to be complete.
Mm-hmm.
The chapter on animals, the 23 or 24 chapters on animals, were later voted by the members of the Animal Behavior Society, the International Society, as the most important book on animal behavior ever. I even beat out Darwin's expressions of the emotions in animals and man in that vote. So it was not that the book itself was rejected, it was the last chapter in which I said these same principles that apply to animals should, in some way, already also apply to human beings.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there already was a lot of evidence that that was the case. Unfortunately, that was proposed at the time when the academic radical left, I think it's fair to call it, was predominant in expressing views, at least, on the relation of science and the human condition. It was a thoroughly blank slate universe of Freud and Skinner and Marxist interpretation. That I plunged into, actually rather unwittingly, since I didn't realize there would be any political feedback. The furor that caused, particularly, it was on the left and mostly the far left, for various reasons that could be gone into that are now mostly of interest to historians of science. It was, how shall I say it, tumultuous time. Now, 30 years later, that's almost all forgotten.
Yeah, it's a different climate.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It is amazing.
Well, what happened was that the psychologists and anthropologists lifted out that part of sociobiology. I don't mean necessarily my book, but the thinking, the Darwinian synthetic thinking. They lifted it out and gave a new name, I think, as much to have their own identity, which was justified as camouflage to protect themselves from the barrage still going on in the 70s and early 80s from the left.
But you think it was partly, you're talking about the term evolutionary psychology?
I am.
They gave you think it was partly camouflage? In other words, fairly or unfairly, and we would both say unfairly, the word sociobiology had acquired some stigma, a political
It did, in the human realm.
Right, and to some extent this was a strategic move on the part of evolutionary psychologists to disassociate.
They went forward with a new banner, but it's still, I think they acknowledge at least a spin-off of the original sociobiology. In fact, sociobiology combined with behavioral ecology have flourished in biology. In fact, not much noted by the intellectual community, but certainly by the scientific community. But now the strange thing is that with the collapse of the radical left's influence in academia, even here at Harvard, a recent poll had a small majority of students classifying themselves as conservative. I mean, it's collapsed, and people coming in now as graduate students at Harvard frequently, even in biology, frequently never even heard of that there was a controversy that's just accepted. Sociobiology is just accepted now, including in the human realm. But now we seem to be developing the potential for heat out of the radical right in this country. The opposition of the religious right to evolution generally is, in fact, largely an expression of their dislike of, human sociobiology. The idea that, if you think about it, namely that the mind and the traits of humanity and the passions and the value formations and so on could evolve biologically, as incidentally Darwin himself saw clearly in his book in 1872.
Right.
That idea is, in fact, the casus belli, the cause of the religious right's continuing assault on the very idea of evolution.
So it's not just the conflict with Genesis, with the creation story in the Bible, you think?
That's the case when you push literalism, interpretation of the Bible, as you get in some of the Protestant, mainly Protestant evangelists. That is true, but the main opposition, the mainstream opposition, is the idea that you have, for example, in the Roman Catholic Church, is to the idea that the human mind could have evolved.
That's an interesting way to look at it. And I mean, so it's partly a materialistic view of behavior, the idea that there may not be a soul.
A physicalist view, if you want to use that word. That is that there is only matter and energy in the universe.
And that's your view.
And that is my view. I think it's a view of the majority of scientists who are statured, that is, who've actually gone deeply enough into science to have done original research, peer-reviewed and generally accepted now in the textbook.
And so are you at all mystified by consciousness? I mean, there are people who are materialists. I think of as basically materialists, like Steve Pinker, who would say that they would put themselves in the category called Mysterians in the mind-body kind of debate, in the sense that they don't really understand kind of why consciousness has to exist, or they don't know how to characterize subjective experience, even if they believe that there is a one-to-one correspondence between subjective experience and physiological state. In other words, you can pin it down to physiological condition, but they're still puzzled by the existence of consciousness. There's something about it. Where do you fall in that debate?
Yeah, I think that was an argument first put forward by Leibniz, wasn't it? He said that if you got inside the brain and you could track every little part of the brain, I don't think he knew about neurons or anything, what was going on inside the head.
Right.
You could understand every little thing that happened, and yet you wouldn't understand the whole. You wouldn't understand the mind. That's an argument which has a certain amount of logic to it. But I think it also underestimates the power of science in synthesizing the masses of data accumulating from reductionistic approaches. In other words, I believe that a Mysterian view of saying, well, maybe it'll always be a mystery, which is adopted by some philosophers and maybe a few neurobiologists, that it never will be grasped. We will never understand why we think. I think that's premature. I believe that's just a statement of we do not yet know. I believe myself that we will come fully to understand what the mind is. I even had a go at it as an amateur in my book, Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. I couldn't pass by that subject and be claiming to talk about the unity of knowledge. And the way I saw it is that what is happening in the mind is literally a recreation of a little world that is what we are, with a self at the center, the central actor, with different parts operating, some out of sight and coming into that world of consciousness. And that is probably the way we'll eventually explain consciousness, and thus the mind. And it will be more than metaphor when we have brain activity fully mapped out.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the book Consilience. You just mentioned the term reductionism, and you mean reductionism in the kind of legitimate sense. I mean, some people use the term to mean the simplistic explanation of behavior or of any system.
Yeah, reductive analysis.
You mean that the ability to explain activity at one level, at a higher level of organization, in terms of laws at a lower level of organization. So, for example, human psychology, explain it in terms of biochemistry, molecular biology, ultimately even in terms of the laws of physics. That's pure reductionism. And first of all, am I right in thinking that to some extent consilience is a polite term for reductionism? I mean, it's a nicer sounding word that doesn't come with any taint, but you're talking about the reductionist project here.
I am in part, but then as I emphasize in the book, science consists of two activities, creative activities. All scientists, successful scientists, biologists, but scientists generally, but biologists assuredly, take a complex system. They take it at some level of biological organization. It can be an ecosystem that now they set out to explain in terms of the units of the next level down. Species and interaction, elements of the environment with which they are interacting. And then those who work on organismic biology are usually doing it initially in an attempt to crack complex systems at the level of the tissue or organ or whole organism, and so on down. it's obvious that you cannot take pure physics and chemistry and predict how an ecosystem is put together. That's the emergent property.
Mm-hmm.
But to say that is not to say that there is not a consistency of explanation from one level to the next. And the way I put it is not explaining an organism or an ecosystem in terms of physics and chemistry, but to say that one of the two great principles of biology is that all biological processes and elements are obedient to the laws of physics and chemistry. In other words, by cracking complex systems sequentially down from ecosystems to macromolecules, cracking them and going on down, then you will find obedience at the lower levels to laws of physics and chemistry. But then science is not just that kind of reductionism. It is true that science right now is primarily reductionism because of the spectacular successes of subatomic physics and of molecular biology. But everyone recognizes that the next stage in science, and including especially biology, is to resynthesize, to put it back together again. Either literally, someday I think we will be able to create a simple prokaryotic organism, either literally or with mathematical models and new experimental tests of our system, so that we finally will begin, at least in certain routes going from molecule to ecosystem, be able to have a more or less, it's not complete, an illuminating.
Okay, so you're kind of an in principle reductionist, leaving aside the question of how soon, if ever, we'll actually realize the complete reductionist project, right? I mean,
I think we will come close within a few decades.
And in any event, it's kind of in principle possible. That's the way the world is structured. In other words, there's no mysterious thing that enters from beyond the realm of physical causality.
Exactly. That's why I refer to myself as a physicalist and not just a materialist. In other words, I have no doubt whatever the molecular biologists will, in the next decade or two, for a simple cell at least, like E. coli, will be able to identify every important element and every important stage in proteomics, that is, the building up from DNA into form protein ensembles.
Mm-hmm.
But that's still identify them, but that's still a long way from putting a cell together and understanding how all the parts are working simultaneously. In theory, that can be done, and eventually will be done for the simplest systems. But we may not be able to cover all of that terrain. We, however, will be able to cover enough to make, I believe, physicalism, literally, physicalism.
And if you're a physicalist, if you're an in principle reductionist, can you still believe in free will in a meaningful sense, or don't you have to be a determinist in principle? I mean,
well, before we enter that fever,
I thought we'd knock that off in about 30 seconds.
No,
and
before we enter
religion.
that fever swamp of philosophy, let me just go back for a moment and tell you why I have some confidence in the program. Synthesis is so terribly difficult that some people don't realize that or even conceive that it can be done. But I would say that it can be done, and as it is done better and better, then what we call emergence, that is properties which are unique to a certain level, ecosystem, organism, and on down, will become
they're unique.
Better known. I mean, we will have understand them in cause and effect, and that's actually the core of the Consilience concept. It's not just reductionism. It's the likelihood of eventually a fairly successful and complete reduction synthesis cycle.
But it's not inconsistent with reductionism, right? In other words,
No.
An emergent property, to say something has an emergent property at some level of organization, say the human social level, is just to say that the most efficient way to describe the behavior at that level is to use the language of these emergent principles. It's the most parsimonious way of talking about
That's
it.
exactly right. Yeah. One of the reasons why I have faith, excuse me, is it's been outside the main developments outside what most people aware about of science and in biology know, and that is the tremendous progress of toward explaining the superorganism, to explain emergent properties, for example, especially in social insects. So my colleague Bert Holdobler and I, who've published and worked together some 20 years here at Harvard, and published the summary book of everything known on the ants, for example, in 1990.
Which won the Pulitzer Prize?
Yes, it was a big surprise. We are now just finishing up a book called The Superorganism, which makes that point, which says, look, organisms we can understand well enough. We can understand the interaction of whole organisms because we can see them, and we can do experiments in the laboratory and move it along, the subject along so quickly. And furthermore, we can, the processes themselves are relatively simple. Pheromone, chemical language by which ants and bees communicate, relatively easy to understand, and so on. So we have been able, that is, the entomologists and others who've worked on social insects, have been able to take the level, to go from the level of organism up to properties that are exhibited only by whole colonies, by superorganisms, and understand it, synthesize it, and really understand it, emergent properties and cause and effect explanation. So I realize this is a very simple system compared to a cell, but nonetheless the success of the work on social insects of the past 40 years has given me that personal faith.
Yeah, well, that brings us back to religion. I want to ask about science religion. I wanted to first quickly give you the opportunity to finish, if you were going to finish, on the subject of free will. I mean, I asked you about free will and whether you can reconcile it with reductionism, and you asked me to postpone the free will question per se. Do you have free will, for example?
You and I do, and I guess everyone watching this does. I almost just at this point try to cop out and say, refer you to Daniel Dennett, who's done this penetrating work on this as I've seen.
He's a compatibilist.
Yeah, but I'll just give you my take on it. In terms of our ability to make personal decisions independently, and combined with our own inability to predict what, except in special narrow categories of behavior, to predict what we're going to be doing from one day to the next, recognizing that any event, small or large, can change the whole direction of our thinking and even the way we think, means that we have what is thought of intuitively at the level of consciousness, full consciousness, intuitively as free will. But if you go down to the level of brain physiology and hereditary propensities and individual history of individuals, and if you knew reliably what their environment was going to be, then you could probably predict a lot of what their behavior would be, a contingency analysis, given certain circumstances. So you start taking it away a little bit, and once you get down to the level of those tens of millions, billions of neurons, and how they're going to wink on and wink out and decay and so on, you can see this becomes maybe a philosopher's dream of determinism. And even then, there's a random element, almost down to the quantum level. Down to the quantum level.
There is de facto random.
So the fact that if you could fill the universe with supercomputers, maybe, and fill the brain of Robert Wright with nano monitors, unobtrusive nano monitors, but then of course you'd be violating one of the basic principles of causation in science. But if you could do that, maybe you could say what Robert Wright was going to be doing for the next 24 hours, and therefore you could tell, oh, you're determined, Bob.
Or you could just ask me, which would be faster.
But you can see what an impossibility it is.
Well, a practical impossibility, but if it's
Yeah.
in principle, but this is what people worry about. If determinism is in principle true, regardless of whether you could actually do the prediction, then people say,
follow
well, I
you,
don't
yeah.
actually
Certainly,
have
you're right.
free
In
will.
other words, in that sense, I was making it all in terms of predictability, wasn't I?
Yeah.
And it's unpredictable. And beyond that, I suppose that we have to stop counting those random changes on a pinhead and come back to the real world, which is the intuitive conception of free will that we started with, which is that we know so little of how our brain works, of how the world is changing, that we have to make so many personal decisions along the way that we are exercising independent of other free wills around us, our own free will. And so in practical terms, if not ultimate terms satisfactory to a philosopher, we have free will.
So you recommend people thinking of themselves as if they had free will and getting on with their lives?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's what I'll do then. I was waiting for your guidance.
Well, I hope it's not in the wrong direction.
No,
but, in a sense, I think that the way we're talking about it helps to solve one of the great theological problems, if you want to do that, which is how can we think of ourselves as independent beings and be responsible if God knows everything we're going to do, and being
right.
omniscient, and then being omniscient, he must.
That was the first appearance, I think, of the free will of the determinism question in intellectual history. I'm not sure, but I think that's the way it first showed up.
I think that must be right, and of course, it's one of the insoluble dilemmas created by semantics and by fuzzy thinking. Fuzzy, subjective, and metaphorical thinking. So I think that recognizing that the existence of a problem does not presuppose the existence of a solution. There are just certain problems which are not valid. I mean, they're so subject to sloppy metaphorical thinking and the unknowns of the world and so on.
And beyond practical testing.
They're not worth thinking about. But in practical terms, that's really what we're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Here. We're really interested in, do we have free will as we intuitively understand it? Whether God knows what we're going to do or not is what counts.
Okay. Well, speaking of God, you've just finished a book that I think has religion and science in the subtitle, An Alliance of Religion and Science, or something like that?
Well, I'm just finishing it now, and it's about to go off to the publisher. And I'll talk a little bit about it because I think that it addresses an important issue. Actually, the title of it would be, as I have it now, Ascending to Nature, subtitle, An Alliance of Science and Religion, which may sound rather strange coming from a scientist who's often, pointed out as to be an atheistic materialist, a secular humanist of the worst kind. But in that category, I can always say, "Oh, I'm to the right of Richard Dawkins." Just an aside. But at any rate, how can I be talking about an alliance of science and religion? Well, I do it in calling on the religious community in one long essay to join the scientists to save the creation. I point out at the beginning that here is an area where we can differ absolutely in how we think the world works and the meaning of humanity, the meaning of life, which is what the cultural war is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And we do differ drastically. And I think insolubly. That is, it is not soluble. So you can take that for what it's worth. And I'm not going to be one of the scientists, who keep waffling and saying, oh, well, science has its role, religion has its role, science has its own kind of truth, religion has its own kind of truth. somehow, as we work more and more, they will somehow come together. I don't believe that for a minute. I don't think that Darwin would have believed it.
I think you used to make noises kind of like that, didn't you? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, this has two parts to it. First of all, I think you're among those who think that the evolution of human intelligence is not all that improbable. I mean, natural selection, nuts and bolts natural selection, encourages through competitive dynamics the growth of intelligence and so on. And I thought I recalled you saying, in principle, you can imagine a kind of deism or something, that natural selection was set in motion, is the unfolding of the divine plan, even though it's a sheerly materialistic system. Did you not say that?
The first part of what you said is correct. Whenever I'm cornered, and I have to use a word about it all, I'll say I'll call myself a provisional deist. Now, a provisional deist is I'll strictly define as someone that considers at least the possibility that the ultimate laws of the universe were set by some kind of intelligence, whether it was satanic, benevolently Judeo-Christian, or some unseen meta-intelligent. The point is that, it's premature to say that because we can define the laws of the universe, we also can define their origin. And I won't go that far. But I would leave open, I consider this a problem in astrophysics, but I would leave this open to the astrophysics physicists mainly, of deism or not. But I absolutely believe that the evidence shows, I think now conclusively, that it's unrealistic, it's false reasoning to believe in a biological God, meaning a God that oversaw and directed the creation and evolution of life. So that is
that intervened in the evolution of life. That did. I mean, you can imagine one that created the first speck of DNA or something, and then let it go from there. But you're saying a guiding hand is not plausible.
I think that parsimony demands that we go with the assumption that life can originate on its own.
Sure.
Because I think we'll do it in the lab before too long, from basic materials.
Right.
And show the conditions under which this could occur autonomously, that is, on its own.
So maybe our creator God was an advanced civilization. I mean, Francis Crick threw that out, I think.
Yeah, you may know what I think about religion. I think religion is an extremely adaptive phenomenon, and it's one of the powerful propensities of the human mind. The human mind is guided by just a small number of extraordinarily intense instinctive drives, and they include mother-infant bonding, they include tribalism, they include quick, hateful response to cheaters. There are a number of things that have begun to work out. The avoidance of instinct, of incest. And I think that religion is one of them, and that that this has always had an enormous Darwinian benefit. The tribes that could believe that they were superior, that were bound together by all of the rituals and the myths and the symbols of solidarity and the rewards of heroism, but above all of their innate superiority as a tribe, were the ones that had the confidence and the willingness to go through personal sacrifice in order to prevail over other tribes. And that's history, almost undeniable principle of history. So we don't need to think that there is how should I put it, a supernal influence.
So the religious impulse is not evidence of a God, because you can explain the impulse itself in biological terms, you think?
Easily.
Right. Now, you've talked about the role of religious impulses in other contexts, including scientific inquiry. and in terms of your own motivation, as
Yeah.
I recall, right?
That's right.
How does that?
I tell you, before we get to that, though, let me finish what I was
Okay.
about the alliance, because anyone listening to
Oh,
us is
right.
going to wonder.
That's where we started.
Well, how is this?
I'm glad somebody's keeping track of this interview.
How is this arch, secularist going to, if he says that he doesn't believe there ever will be resolution, how is he going to form an alliance? Well, you can form an alliance between people of different tribes and of completely different world views, and that's essentially what I'm proposing. I'm using this, to let's get together. Let's, on the near side of metaphysics, let's leave that a little bit toward the horizon. Let's get together
on specific issues?
On specific issues. And because science and religion combined are today the two most powerful forces in the world. And if you can combine them to address particular issues, one is obviously world poverty, but another is saving the creation. This is at the heart of a Judeo-Christian tradition. I don't care about the interpretations that say, well, conquering the world or being put in charge of the world in Genesis, which happened. I don't believe that meant, and this is the way Billy Graham correctly put it, that mandate does not mean trashing the world. It means taking care of it. And that is fundamental Judeo-Christian and, Abrahamic religious belief. And and I think it's probably at the heart of most of the Eastern religions as well. And since most people are devoutly religious, and around the world and in the United States, most are religious to a strong degree. It is therefore follows that if we could combine our effort to save the creation, save biodiversity, save the world's ecosystems, the world in which we were born, then we would actually see some action on a subject that's very dear to my heart, which is saving the rest of life.
So you'd like a kind of an alliance between science and religion for kind of policy purposes, for pragmatic purposes. As far as reconciling their metaphysical worldviews, I gather the only two possibilities you see are a kind of a deism that we talked about, and maybe a kind of a pantheism. Like if you want to view the whole universe as, in some sense, God, fine. Or I don't know. Do you even go that far?
No, I just
you would grant that
I leave deism open as mostly.
And that's the only one. That's the only one you see. That's the only potential reconciliation.
Well, let me put it this way, Bob. If new evidence came in tomorrow, say for intelligent design, if that could be devised, no one can figure out how to devise it, but if it were, I would be quick to change my mind, or start reconsidering everything.
Yeah, well, that's intelligent design. Its adherents call it the theory of intelligent design. I don't even understand the sense in which it's a theory. I mean, what is the intelligent design movement, so far as you can tell?
It's a default argument. It says that essentially all it says is that biologists haven't explained some of the most complex phenomena in terms of evolution. They can understand how evolution could create it. And therefore, there must be somebody who put it together. If it can't come autonomously from mutation and natural selection, which is the heart of Darwinian or modern biological thinking, let's say, then there must be something else, and that has to be an intelligent designer. That's it.
So it's not a testable alternative theory.
No, it's a default argument. And default arguments are sometimes stimulating in real science for getting research started.
Right.
You say, oh God, we haven't, we've explained a lot here. It all fits together. We haven't explained this. This just doesn't extend or explain that, so we better start taking new directions. That works as a strategy of creative thinking in science, but it never becomes a theory.
Right.
To say that, well, we haven't explored, we don't understand that yet, therefore God must be doing it, or somebody outside. And also, I want to point out two things to the intelligent designers and, those who have hope for this approach. It's not science. There's no way, there's not a shred of evidence for it. There's no way, no mechanism, no way it could happen that we could ever understand. Therefore, it depends almost entirely on the pointing to the areas that the proponents are claiming to be insoluble. But that is very dangerous. First of all, from their point of view, particularly from the fundamentalist, and particularly the literalist point of view, one, it concedes that evolution occurs. That's a big concession. Two, it depends for its authentication on the continued existence of unsolved problems in evolution. But if you look at the history of evolutionary biology and molecular biology, of the last 30, we've been knocking those off one after the other. I mean, they're like shooting balloons at a state fair. And if creationists stake everything or make it pivotal on the default argument, then they're going to find themselves in a very, very poor position. And therefore, the whole religious approach. You know, if I can natter on for a moment, there's another issue here that needs to be dispelled, you know, a claim on the side of the defenders of religious orthodoxy in explaining away evolution. And that is that there's some kind of a conspiracy by scientists that you know, evolution is a religion of its own, it's an ideology. And that there has to be some kind of a conspiracy that calls virtually all statured biologists, meaning, you know, biologists of proven originality and insight and so on, people who've established themselves through important, influential, peer-reviewed articles. Some sort of conspiracy among all these people, not a one of which, incidentally, accepts intelligent design, of my knowledge. No, there are no statured scientists who accept this or takes it seriously. But is there a conspiracy? Can there be a conspiracy in science, among scientists? No way. And I'll tell you why, which you personally, I know you would understand anyway. The entire culture of science is based on verifiable discovery. Making an original discovery is the gold and silver of science. You make an important discovery, and therefore then you are an important scientist. You can be any kind of a jerk, you know, otherwise, and never make another discovery, and you've made it as an important science. You go into the textbooks, and if it's important enough, into the history books. You are richly rewarded with prizes, with prestige, with all sorts of other Roman values, you know, and that give you small triumph. It's what every young scientist wants. Any young scientist, or well, any scientist of any age, who could be the first to demonstrate intelligent design, or even show how to test it and prove it, would immediately become one of the greatest scientists in the world. He would make history. He'd get the Nobel, he'd get the Templeton Prize, which was set up, you know, to encourage the getting together of religion and science. And there's nothing that a young scientist would want to do more than to achieve something like that. Mm-hmm. Science is its value system is very different from that of most Western, most processes or organizations or institutions, activities of Western civilization.
Yeah, the thing that puzzles me about intelligent design, I mean, one of a number of things, some of its adherents, they concede that natural selection can do some things, and so they concede that in principle natural selection can create things that look as if they were consciously designed because they're so functionally adaptive. Mm-hmm. But then they'll just point to some things and go and say, "Oh no, but that looks kind of too much like it's." I mean, once you've conceded the point in principle, I don't see I don't see how they think they can draw a clear line. I mean, natural
That's
selection
right.
can build on complexity and build on complexity in principle ad infinitum. And
Well, it could, and as I say, there one complex system after another that seemed almost impossible to explain by evolutionary process, stepwise, has been explained that way, and then more and more evidence adduced to show that, in fact, that's probably the way it did happen. So this is they are the intelligent designers are very vulnerable, not only from the growing corpus of scientific knowledge, but also in the weakness that they provide, that they give to the fundamentalists. They could be the fundamentalists' worst enemy.
because they're conceding natural selection has some
Because they're
power.
conceding evolution.
Right.
And they're conceding natural selection for a lot of phenomena. But they're making it the strong point of the scientific, actually, the pseudoscience, well, okay, the seemingly scientific foundation of modern fundamentalist belief. By doing that, and if they draw these allies, the literalists and others, members of the religious community into it, then they're going to be putting all of them in a vulnerable position.
Now, we started to talk about ways that the religious impulse can manifest itself in other contexts like science, and actually has in your own life, I think,
Yes.
right? In your scientific life.
Sure.
I mean, you were conventionally religious as a teenage Southern Baptist, and Darwinism displaced your Christian faith, and fairly straightforwardly, I think, in your college years. But you've carried some aspects of religious experience or emotion or motivation into your science, right?
Oh yeah. One writer recently referred to the Baptist within me, and I'll grant it readily, because many of the traditions of Southern Baptism linger, and that includes independence of thought. There are no priests or ministers in a conventional sense.
Right, it's
But
decentralized.
essentially a pastor who looks over the flock who are working on, understanding the Bible and interpreting it on their own and so on. Of course, Southern Baptism has evolved, as any strong religion would, into a very tradition-bound set of beliefs. And someone has referred to, or many have referred to, Southern Baptism with 15 million members strong, at the last count I heard, as the Roman Catholicism of the South. In other words, it's the dominant religion, but it does have its star pastors and so on. But that sense of independence was bred into me. You have to learn it on your own. You have to decide to come to the altar on your own. That's so strong that I'm surprised that so few former Southern Baptists I know of, as opposed to Presbyterians and so on, have gone so strongly into science. But I may be wrong on that. That's not relevant. The other thing about Southern Baptism was the passion. Evangelism is a passionate expression of self and belief. And I often tune into one of the evangelical sermons, star quality, one of the star evangelists. Yeah, and enjoy it, listening to it and watch it unfold. I watch it the way an Italian watches opera. In other words, I enjoy the performance.
You may have
certainly
offended some Italians there, but anyway.
What's that?
I said you may have offended some Italian opera buffs there. But
I could not, because, of course, opera is one of the great achievements. But, a well-delivered evangelical sermon is a considerable
it's a
cultural
beautiful
achievement. At any rate, the point is, these people and I, in my origin, address subjects with passion. And to me, that is what scientific research is all about passion, the great excitement of discovery and what it all means. I always thought that all scientists thought like that, but maybe, they don't.
To read books of yours like Sociobiology or On Human Nature, one would get the impression that you're very conscious of being an animal yourself. Right, you're conscious that human beings are animals. I'm wondering if that is a burden in everyday life or a blessing or what? I mean, does it enter your consciousness often or affect the way you approach life? Or
That's a very interesting question. I never was asked that question before. But it's a very important one, too. And I'd say my response can immediately be it enriches my life. It's helped me enormously. When you realize that you are an animal, then you understand the imperfections of your body, you understand your longevity, and you understand your place in the real world so much better that it gives peace. And having peace and having a sense that you belong here, that you were raised here, so to speak, the species was raised here, you are more inclined to be engaged with it. The real world to a lot of people, most people nowadays, I suppose, really means social, their community of other human beings. And nature is just incidental, and their bodies are just way stations to another life. And that has some pretty severe restrictions on the full poetry of your understanding of your existence. So it gets richer for me as time goes on, and I know more about myself and the species. Also, many people might think that realizing our animal nature, our animal origins, precludes eternal existence. And suppose that must disturb the peace of the non-believer. It is, I think, if anything, the opposite. You make peace.
So the fact that you anticipate death being the end does not bother you?
Not at all. I saw a recent poll of members of the National Academy of Sciences, which are 2,000 or so, who are supposed to be the science elite of this country, elected by peer voting. And something like 90% registered no concern about an afterlife.
And it's actually enriching in some ways, you're saying, to know there's no afterlife? It actually enriches your life or your approach to it?
Well, I'm not going to take Pascal's argument and join a church just to be safe, but sure, I'm perfectly happy with mortality and the limited number of years I have left, as was, I think, most scientists and major philosophers in the past. In fact, eternity is something that the believers ought to take more seriously in calculating how this is going to affect them, particularly after the first trillion years, shall we say, of bliss, when it's enough time has passed so that this universe will evolve and pass away, and new ones by the million, one after the other, will come and pass away. And what it meant, that they are in that existence, eternal existence. That's just the beginning of eternity. That they are in that existence in heaven or hell for all that amount of time incomprehensible to the human mind and more to come, because of some decision they made about a particular religion at an infinitesimal segment of time. And when you look at it that way and realize that the human mind cannot exist in bliss, that's not the way the mind works. It needs time. It needs a time scale to exist.
So you don't
then you begin to think, well, maybe it isn't so bad to lose eternity after all.
in exchange for having a sense of the texture of time.
That's right.
So you think they may find themselves unhappy in heaven then? If they, of course, you don't think they'll find themselves, but
they're going to find themselves bored.
You think they would find it a little
monotonous. They're going to find themselves bored and wish that they had more people like Darwin to talk to, whom I presume is not going to be there. I'm speaking now.
Depends on the criteria.
Of course.
He lived a good life.
I'm speaking now of the fundamentalists who really, and hopefully few in number, who really believe in a sharp distinction between heaven and hell.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting that you said Darwinian view gives you a sense of belonging, because, of course, some conventionally religious people would say, no, they have a sense of belonging because they think there's a God that intended them to be here.
That's how they get their sense of belonging.
Right, but yours derives. How would you characterize exactly what your sense of belonging derives from?
It derives from a realistic, science-based view of what individuals, human beings are, and where they came from, and their species. You belong to the species, and you belong to this world that created the species.
So you're part of the family
Absolutely.
Of organic life in a literal sense. You can actually trace the family tree.
Yeah, that, if anything, is an essential statement of what could be called a philosophy of naturalism.
Okay. Now, what some people say they don't like about thinking about themselves as animals in light of sociobiology or evolutionary psychology or whatever, is some of the things they say are that to think of love or altruism as being ultimately in some sense self-interested, even though it may be a remote sense. It may just be that the altruism was in the interest of your genes and the environment of our evolution, and it may or may not serve your interests or your genes' interests now, but still, the very idea that these things originated for self-interested reasons and sometimes are still deployed in a covertly selfish way, even an unconsciously selfish way. A lot of people say this devalues love or somehow unsettles them.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think it does devalue it. I imagine that some feel that it might. But it's somewhat comparable to the truth that would come from thinking of the brain as the instrument, the musical instrument that has been developed over millions of years, and of the playing out of human nature in an evolving culture as a beautiful melody. And the emotions felt as part of it. And when you look at it that way, and you realize that there is almost infinite beauty possible from the instrument and from the permutations and creation of the melodies, then an organic origin doesn't seem quite, it does not become debasing at all. What's debasing in my mind is the thought that we're just creatures who are almost like puppets put on earth by a superior being who we really can't quite understand, and whose dicta are that we are to follow or laid down appropriate to desert tribes, patriarchal tribes some 3 millennia ago, and do not apply easily to most of humanity. So that is what's restricting, and also when seen as a source of unending tribal conflict. My God is superior to your idols. My purity of thought and belief is high above your corruption and error. I think then that the naturalistic view, which allows adaptation of the mind and a much broader seeking of truth from the natural world and from inward examination, is much the better way to go.
You know, it's funny you should use the word puppets in describing what bothers you about a religious worldview, because I don't know if you remember, but the Time magazine cover in the mid-1970s about the sociobiology controversy had these marionettes, actual people, but rigged up as marionettes.
That's right.
So clearly the view from the other side was that yours is the worldview that would have us as puppets.
Yeah, as seen from the left. That's true. Wasn't that interesting? But that was due to a misconception about what human nature is. It was a view of human genetic determinism that no one believed, the sociobiologist or anyone else believed. They could easily see that that was not true, and it was never anything I proposed.
Right. Do you think believing in God would make it easier to be a moral person, or in other words, do you find it hard to be good without God?
I find it easier to be good.
Without God?
Yeah.
And what's the secret?
Internalization of sense of responsibility and of understanding of the necessity of moral beliefs. Furthermore, I do believe, and I think you've even published a book on the subject, Bob, that we are, whether we evolved by kin selection primarily or group selection, which is now open again as a possibility, that we are hardwired to make moral decisions that do operate for the good of others. And it's not, that is not overthrown by rejecting a particular mythology involving divine creation of the species.
So understanding the utility of the moral impulses, the fact that they had to earn their way into our lineage by being useful in some sense and possibly useful at a social level.
Certainly that, but also you just feel good when you do something that's right. And I won't try to put that in words, except to say, why do you feel good?
Yeah.
When you do something right, when you do something brave, when you take care of others, when you are honest when it's difficult to be. You feel good whether you're a devout Christian or whether you're a secular humanist. It's because your brain is wired that way.
Yeah. Do you get a great feeling, I do, from when somebody stops and asks you directions and you know and you can give them the directions?
Sure.
Does that make you feel really good?
Sure it does.
And that's interesting because
Yeah.
there are people you don't know, they will never return the favor.
Yeah.
So it's not, certainly in a modern environment, it's not ultimately self-interested behavior. A lot of people would argue that it was in the environment of our evolution. You would have seen people again and again. But anyway, it's just interesting. It's one of the most gratifying parts of my life,
Yeah.
when it happens.
I think of most persons' lives. A recent poll, that is last few years anyway, has shown that believers and non-believers, the latter would include, I guess, what you call secular humanists, do not differ in their crime rate, divorce rate, and other outward signs of moral-based behavior, except one. I think fundamentalist scored higher in participating and volunteering and participating in public service. Mm-hmm. Non-professional public service.
Which is a good thing.
Absolutely. Secular humanists ought to do more. And they'd feel very good if they did.
You're a kind of a phenomenally productive person. I have to assume you don't have much in the way of vices, which is interesting because vices, by and large, are succumbing to animal appetites, right? I mean, that's what a lot of what we call vice is, various kinds of addictions to various bad habits. Well, am I right? I mean,
No.
and you don't. Can you think of any vices that you A, have and B, want to share with the world? They're you can answer those questions.
That's
separately.
a disturbing question, and I guess I don't have vices to speak of, and except pride. I've got a lot of that.
You think sometimes you have too
Maybe
much?
it's maybe overweening. I enjoy excelling and I enjoy getting credit for it, and I enjoy dreaming of glorious deeds gloriously rewarded. But I think I'm completely normal in that. Maybe I do more of it than the average person, and that would be by definition of vice. But I don't drink except occasional glass of wine. I don't smoke. I never strayed in my marriage, and you can look at it as one, you can say, oh, you're a virtuous person, but also one way I look at it is that it allowed me to write more books.
Was that the reason you didn't stray, or?
That's one reason. Oh, no, not straying. No, I had a very good marriage. But the point is that, these other things I didn't fall into, gambling and so on, because I was driven. I wanted to achieve just as much as my life would allow it in science and writing and thinking.
Okay, well, that leads to just one other question. In your book, The Insect Societies, it's dedicated to your wife. And as I recall, it says something like, to Irene who understands.
That's right.
And maybe I'm wrong. I've always thought that meant that she understood something about you or about your behavior, or was tolerant of something about you or your behavior.
That's right.
What is it?
No, that's exactly right.
What is it? What's she tolerant of? What is there that she needs? I mean,
single-mindedness, I think. That is putting more time into that work that might have been spent with family. I'll admit it. But on the other hand, a writer or a person who can work at home, as a writer does, and as I did, a lot of my work was theoretical and compositional, and I even did experiments. I built a laboratory at home and did experiments at home. I did much of my systematic work
with ants.
With ants at home. And more as the years wore on. So even though probably I had working hours much longer than the average person, at one point I was working 80 or 90 hours a week, but pushing through a book that is very complex. Even so, I saw more of my family than most people do. Most people in other professions who are coming in for 9 to 5 or having to go on business trips and so on. So there's a little lessening of the guilt. When you're writing a book, I'm sure that must be your case also. You can stop anytime you want. You get tired of doing something and take a 30-minute break and chat with your wife, partner, friend, whoever, and then you go back to it. So they see perhaps more of you and hear more from you than would be the case if you were engaged in conventional work.
Well, that's great. So you've been able to reconcile the two great conflicting forces in many people's lives, career and family.
By the luck of the choice of my devotion. I suppose that if I were a diplomat or a professional soldier or a businessman, not so.
Well, congratulations. And thanks a lot for taking the time. This has been a lot of fun.
Bob, thank you. It was great having yet another conversation with you. The ones we've had now go back over
longer than either of us cares to remember, as they say.
I won't mention it, but it's measured in decades.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.